Mimi. The recent acquisition of the Senusret Collection is scheduled for an exhibition in 2023 and provides the opportunity to collaborate again with Dr. Elias. In February of 2020, just before the pandemic started, we had the privilege of having Dr. Elias, Linda Hartwick, who's the Carlos Curator of Ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern Art, and Chief Conservator Renee Stein, at Emory Hospital to conduct CT scans of the two mummies that are being discussed. During the last year, he's had time to analyze the data from these tests and will share it with us tonight. As he speaks, you'll have questions, I'm sure, and comments, so please submit them in the Q&A function on Zoom. And after the talk, Dr. Elias, Melinda, and Renee will join in answering them live. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Elias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Torres. It's a pleasure to be with you all this evening to talk about these two fascinating mummies. As Dr. Torres mentioned, the project took place in February of 2020, and you can see in these images the mummies as they appeared in the storage facility at the Michael C. Carlos Museum. We have two mummies. We have Tah Osiris on the left and Padibastet on the right. And the mummies were CT scanned at Emory University Hospital on the evening of February 25th, 2020. The work was done with the kind and actually wonderful assistance of Dr. Torres and the radiological staff of Emory University Hospital. And the product of the scanning evening were two excellent data sets on these mummies acquired in a late model CT scanner of very high quality. So the data produced in the procedure was just top notch. It was a wonderful evening. And I'd just like to point out the irony of that evening in the sense that as we drove to the hospital in rush hour traffic, I'm sure you're all wondering, why are you showing lanes of traffic? This is a mummy CT scan talk, I thought. But I just couldn't help but show that as the mummy moved towards the CT scanning facility, where we would unravel its mysteries, none of the drivers stuck in rush hour traffic knew a thing about it. And at the same time, as we drove down the road past the CDC experts were trying to deal with the opening shots of the novel coronavirus, which we now know so much about. So it was a very historical evening, let me tell you. Both of the mummies come from an ancient site known as Akhmim, located about 290 miles south of the modern capital of Egypt, Cairo. And the site was important in ancient times as the seat of a fertility cult of a god by the name of Min, who you see on the right. The site really deserves the name necropolis because the cemeteries of Akhmim cover vast terrain. And it's not just one cemetery, but multiple cemeteries, and I'll be talking about them this evening. Before we get into the analysis, I'd like to remind everyone, and we've all seen programs on the topic of mummification, I'm sure, that mummification is a form of religious expression. We'd like to think that mummifying an individual was simply a set of technical procedures, but it was much, much more. It was really, each mummy was really an expression of a set of rituals which were carefully followed in order to produce an incorruptible being which we see in this lovely painting from the site of Akhmim, by the way, lying on the lion-headed bier or mummification bed. You have an incorruptible being known as a sah in the ancient language. And it was important to the Egyptians that that mummy be made in such a way so that it would be recognizable to the soul of the deceased, known in Egyptian as a ba, conceived of as a winged, a bird with a human head. You know, we must remember that at death, the Egyptians were like us. We don't know what happens. But according to their religion, it was believed that the soul was separated from the body and from other parts of what go into making up a human being. And that through the production of a mummy by the proper process, the ba or soul would be able to reunite with that body and begin the journey toward resurrection. I'd also like to point out below the mummification bier, 4 jars, each of which conceptualizes a different deity in charge of a different set of internal organs. We have, from right to left, the human-headed Imseti in charge of the liver, Hapi in charge of the lungs with the head of a baboon, the jackal-headed Duamutef in charge of the stomach, and the falcon Kebsenuef in charge of protecting and keeping well the intestinal organs. These canopic gods, these protective gods, were, in a sense, made into rolled up packets of their own and deposited into the mummies of the period that we will be discussing, known as the Ptolemaic period. So if you hear me talk about visceral packets, and I will be doing a lot of that, you can get an idea of what they are at the outset. These are large cylindrical rolled up linen bundles with pieces of an individual's internal organs inside, 4 in each mummy. I've already alluded to some extent to the way Egyptians prepared bodies, but let me go through it phase by phase. Phase 1 was evisceration, the removal of internal organs, and includes brain removal as well in many cases. The internal organs are separated from the body and are separately preserved while the body itself undergoes phase 2, which is known as desiccation. The desiccation was usually done chemically by packing the body in a type of salt compound known as natron, a mixture of sodium, sodium carbonate, sodium bicarbonate, and several other minerals, which occurred as a compound in certain parts of Egypt. It's extremely drying, and after 35 to 40 days, the body lost at least half of its weight. Water was extracted, and the body was well underway to being incorruptible, preservable over centuries. The body would then be rinsed. Often it's thought with palm wine, if the classical historian Herodotus is to be believed. And then the organs would be reinserted. Phase 3 would then follow, which would consist of bandaging. And it must be pointed out that bandaging to the ancient Egyptians was a ritual act. We know that the separate bandages going into a mummy had names, and that particular bandages would be tied on at particular junctures to basically achieve an important ritual purpose at different points in the voluminous wrapping of the mummies. Phase 4 would follow, consisting of dressing the exterior of the mummy. The shroud would be placed. cartonnage trappings, cartonnage being a form of pasteboard made of linen and stucco, etc., and then painted decoratively. As we can see on the right, a mummy from Thebes of the Ptolemaic period. We have a colorful foot cover made of this cartonnage material. Similarly, the mask, gilded. The mummies that we have studied are similarly equipped, and I will talk about that in greater detail in a moment. What is often missed is that at the last stage of phase 4, the mummy would be bedecked in garlands and wreaths, which would help it to appear vindicatable. In other words, in the court of Osiris, the god of the netherworld, a body so caparisoned would be seen as justified in the eyes of the god of the netherworld himself and be given admittance to the netherworld to continue on the path to resurrection. I may already have mentioned that these mummies date to a period known as the Ptolemaic period. And for our purposes, I'll simply say that this is the period in Egypt after Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 331 BC. He had a good friend, the leader of his household cavalry, known as Ptolemy, one of his generals. Alexander never actually ruled in Egypt. He continued on his journeys of conquest through the Persian Empire and did not return alive. But Ptolemy, this friend of his, returned the body of Alexander to a new founded city known as Alexandria. And Alexandria formed the capital of Egypt in this period. The rulers of Egypt were Macedonian in descent. They were not native Egyptian. And to answer the basic question of what was going on in Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, I can only say that much of it involved the building of temples. The Ptolemies were obsessed with size. They were obsessed with the construction of large state temples, which would allow them to glorify themselves, but at the same time appease the priesthoods of the native Egyptian people who they now ruled. This slide shows the temple of Edfu, a very well-preserved Ptolemaic temple. And one should note that this was a difficult undertaking for the kings, largely because of the expense. And in Egypt during the Ptolemaic time, the situation was often quite roiling. There was quite a bit of tension between the native population and the Macedonian rulers of the country. And the people had the burden of constructing these immensities, as beautiful as they are to us. It was very difficult. And in fact, this particular temple construction had to halt several times because of internal rebellion against the Ptolemaic regime. So Egypt in the Ptolemaic period, and this relates to the lives of our mummies and how they appear to us on CT, relates to the political turmoil to some extent and the living conditions in Egypt during this particular period. The medical topics that we look at when we study mummies have to be separated into several different kinds. Some are visible through the CT information, through the X-ray imagery that we are able to acquire. Others require histological or invasive procedures using endoscopes and so forth, and are not part of this project at this time. We are concerned with the X-ray information acquired through the CT scanner, so we are able to say things about dental health, which relates to diet and nutrition, skeletal trauma, certain pathological conditions, including atherosclerosis, where you might have something which will appear in a CT image, like a vascular occlusion or plaque on the heart. But in other cases, we must await some future day when tests could be done on tissue samples extracted from the mummy and then examined under a microscope. But for our purposes this evening, we will be concerned with the X-ray information alone. And just to say something about CT, we take it for granted today that CT is available and it is part of many wonderful medical treatments and diagnoses. But this was not in existence before 1971-72. The official year of invention is 1973 for computed tomography by Sir Godfrey Hunsfield. And the first Egyptian mummy, it didn't take long before it was scanned, or at least its head was scanned in 1976 and then published in 1977 in a famous paper. But since that time, more and more mummies have been subjected to CT scanning, and therefore we are able to say much more than ever before about the meaning of certain radiographic features that we see in the scans. A few historical photos to illustrate what I'm talking about. Around the time that CT was being invented, conventional X-ray radiography was being employed on mummies. So on the left, we can see a mummy in Reading, Pennsylvania, undergoing conventional X-ray. 6 months later, another mummy from a Pennsylvania collection was taken to Detroit and subjected to a full autopsy. The mummy on the left, which underwent the conventional X-ray, still exists today and in fact has been CT scanned. The mummy on the right underwent an autopsy, a very important one. We do not autopsy mummies in this manner anymore, and probably no mummy has been autopsied in this fashion since about 1995. This mummy also still exists. It has been scanned in 2009 at the University of Pennsylvania, but there's no more information within the body to the extent to which we have fully preserved information in the mummy on the left. I should also mention that Ptolemaic mummies are not one thing. There are many different types made in different regions. And in our project, we assume that no mummies are identical to other mummies. Each one will be its own thing. They will display patterns. There will be much that is shared, but each mummy we take very seriously as an individual, and we view the process of comparing them one against the other as central to what it is that we are trying to learn culturally about Egyptian mummies. A map of the Akhmim region. And the first thing you can see is that, there are many subsidiary sites around Akhmim. And then I want to point out that just south of Akhmim, which is really a native Egyptian center with the Temple of Min at its center, and across the river, Athribis. At Athribis, you had another temple to the wife of the god Min. And then to the south, just across that purple border you see in the map, you have the royal city founded by the Ptolemies for Greek settlers at Ptolemais. As you might imagine, there was quite a bit of tension between that Greek population and the native Egyptian population located in Akhmim. Here's a close-up of the Akhmim area. Uh, Akhmim once had one of the largest temples in Egypt. It's still buried today below a mound of rubble. There are plans to excavate it. It was still standing in the 14th century and then was toppled in an earthquake in the 14th century and has completely disappeared. But it was one of Egypt's largest temples to the god Min. In red on this map are the various cemeteries in the Akhmim region. And within the green rectangle, in a cemetery known as El Hawawish, which means in Arabic, the place of the enclosures, we have the probable find spot of the two mummies we're discussing here tonight. We don't know exactly where, but we know it is pretty likely that both mummies came from this particular cemetery based upon when this cemetery was first excavated, which was 1884, 1885. And here it is in this slide, a golden ridge beyond the palm trees. And the first time I saw it, I was just amazed because that's how it was always described in the historical accounts. A sandy golden ridge will be the marker of that cemetery. And when I first arrived at the site, that's exactly what it was. A beautiful place, filled with tombs, many of which have been excavated. Again, in 1884, 1885, especially in the 1885 season, in a 2-week period, it is recorded that over 800 mummies were excavated at this site. Very few records were kept, however, and that makes our work all the more challenging and exciting. It's a great place to visit. Some of the tombs are filled with mud brick vaults. There's quite a bit of complexity, and none of it has been recorded beyond just a few tombs, 1 or 2 articles, an occasional guide. So much work is needed. And you can see the extent of the cemeteries in the Akhmim region. In the hill beyond is yet a different cemetery known as El Salamuni. In the foreground, we have El Hawawish. In order to understand the place of the mummies at Emory that we're studying, we put together a comparison group of 15 other mummies in other museums throughout the world, and it hardly exhausts the number of Akhmeemic mummies of the Ptolemaic period that are available in collections throughout the world. We just selected 15 because we needed to get the report completed for purposes of interpretation for the upcoming exhibition. And we can see some of these mummies are in Cairo, the 2 on the right, both of which the Akhmim Mummy Studies Consortium has CT scanned and researched. And then mummies all over the place: Milwaukee, Pennsylvania, north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, France, in Raz. It's actually, this mummy in Raz is actually in the Cathedral Museum in Raz, very important cathedral. Bet you didn't know that even cathedrals can have a mummy. The colorful art of Akhmim is so easily recognized, it makes our job fun and a little bit easier because we can identify so quickly when we have an Akhmeemic mummy based upon the styles of the coffin. Here's the software environment, and this is what an Akhmeemic mummy looks like when it's reconstructed using the CT data to do volumetric reconstruction. But often we work in 2 dimensions in order to do our work. The process we follow is called mummy mapping. We began doing it in 2004 and developed it further in 2009. And it's essentially a methodology by which we trace the images very carefully that are acquired from the scanner. And we label each image very, very carefully so that we're able to return to a pinpoint location within the scan without getting lost. We don't want to miss some small object that might be important by getting ahead of ourselves. And as you might imagine, when you have CT scan data for an entire mummy, you're talking about over 2,000 slices through a human body, perhaps more in some cases. The amount of information is staggering, so that if you do not carefully label where you are at any given time and methodically go back to those locations to look and to survey, almost like going through a jungle, making sure that you count every palm tree, you will miss something. And here's just a screenshot from my computer showing one of the two Emory mummies with all of the images, well, just a portion of them really, carefully labeled by slice number so that we can go back and see exactly where everything is. We'll begin with Tah Osiris. The first thing that comes to mind with her mummy is how well preserved she is. Just an amazingly well-preserved mummy. Even the surface shroud is in place almost with the original wrinkles as spread on the body 2,300 years ago, hardly even tattered. It's quite amazing. On top of that shroud, there were these cartonnage plaques, a cartonnage mask, and 3 body plaques. Ptolemaic mummies are known for these plaques. Many of them are gilded. Gilded masks are very popular in that period. And then gilding of some of the other elements as well. It was very common at Akhmim for a mummy to be equipped with a suit made up of these cartonnage elements, a mask, and at Akhmim, generally 3 body plaques. So a mask plus 3 cartonnage body plaques per mummy. At other sites, you'll have a mask and 4 body plaques. At Thebes, for example, one-piece suits were popular in the Ptolemaic period. Some people had 2, a mask, and then the rest of the body was covered in cartonnage. So each Egyptian site had a different approach to how the dead should be dressed after mummification. Tah Osiris was equipped with a beautiful anthropoid coffin. And the pictures on the right show you the quality of the artistry of this piece. And it's so vivid, so wonderful, with its protective deities standing vigil over the deceased to give each deceased person exactly the same level of protection, integrative magic, as Osiris himself would have received in mythological time. Tah Osiris, we know based on our study, was a female aged over 30 years and probably over 35 years at time of death. Her living stature was just under 5 feet, which, based on what we know and what figures we have, is slightly below average. So the notion of how short they were back then, it isn't really as true as we'd like to believe. Tah Osiris, again, was about 4'10", 4'11", and this was below average height for females in the Ptolemaic period. The mode of treatment is consistent with a normal practice during the Ptolemaic period. In other words, the brain was fully extracted, removed, no cerebral tissue remains within her brain case. The route of excerebration was through the nose, and a perforation through the ethmoid plate was created in order to extract the brain. It was done very neatly and expertly by the embalmers of that period. Her face was covered with a special preparation of resin, which is really a botanical-based sap in which small nodules appear. We don't know chemically what those nodules were, but we think it's possible that they were this protective salt natron mixed in with the resin and then packed on her face. The level of resin, which was then poured into the cranial cavity in place of the brain, is relatively low in her case. But nonetheless, the things we learned about the process of mummification from this mummy were quite astounding. We learned, for example, that the resin which appeared in the body cavities below the head probably got there by being poured down the throat, because in the case of Tah Osiris, we have a small cloth inserted into the mouth to keep that resin from flowing back into the oral cavity. And here we see the resin and natron packed just below the nostrils and over the upper lip. It's quite extensive, and it's really an important aspect of funerary treatment at Akhmim. We can see it here also, the material packed into each nostril. And then in various sinuses within the skull, we see the levels of resin that had been poured into the head to preserve it. The preservation of this mummy is really excellent. Another mysterious feature of Tah Osiris was a band of what we call radiographically as high attenuated material. This is a metallic substance poured into the ankle of the mummy, and we have every reason to believe that it was done anciently. It is a one-off. We do not have, and I've looked at a lot of mummies, hundreds, another mummy with this particular feature. The ankle, we do know, however, is sometimes in other mummies the center for some protective devices, magical devices. There's a mummy in the British Museum, for instance, in which the ankle is covered with a similar type of band, non-metallic, but in the same location. So we're looking at this very closely, but at this point it is still a mystery, but it is not a modern rigging of the mummy. So for example, it is not something that was poured in by a person in 1890 to stabilize the feet. That is not what is going on here. This is probably a symbolic element added on metallically in antiquity. At least that's what we believe at this point. And again, you can see what I mean by mummy mapping. By using those various images, we're able to clarify what appears radiographically. Now, obviously, people that are used to looking at CT imagery or X-rays can look at the image on the left and say, oh, yes, I have an idea of what's going on there. But in order to communicate what's going on to a more general public, these maps are very, very handy. And in fact, doing a map is itself a form of discipline, which makes you think very carefully about what it is that you are recording as you make your map. So we have, and we're getting to the point where I'm talking about visceral packets, a group of 4 visceral packets, all in the left-hand side of the body. And again, something I should point out is that all of these X-ray images are the reverse of what the viewer's standpoint is. So I may seem to be making a mistake in saying that this is the left, but from the individual's point of view, this is the left side of their body. This small group, or I should say group of small packets, is an interesting aspect of her burial. Packets become larger later on in the Ptolemaic period. At this point, we are putting a date of about 300 BC to 275 BC for the mummy of Tah Osiris. So she's Ptolemaic, but she's early Ptolemaic. We have cloth known as wadding put into the body just to stop up the opening through which the interior body parts were removed. And then this mummy also has a very interesting resin mass, artificial but ancient, placed into the pelvic cavity. Here's a comparison from one of the other mummies in our comparison group. And we can see that the visceral packets are much larger. They're distributed in pairs on either side of the vertebral column. And we look at things like that. We don't necessarily understand everything that we're seeing, but we record it as visitors to a country for the first time. Here's a blown up image showing this resin mass inside the pelvic cavity of Tah Osiris. And from studying other mummies of the same period from Akhmim, from the same site, we know that occasionally the embalmers, in addition to the 4 visceral packets, would put magical elements inside the pelvis or other areas of the body, perhaps to relieve some problem which they were aware of that we can only guess at or begin to understand. There's a mummy in a small town in Pennsylvania, which has a very similar preparation inside of its pelvis. And in that particular mummy, the adjacent hip and femur had a terrible break and a vascular necrosis. So it seemed to us in that particular mummy that the preparation was meant to address the physical problem, which probably ended that individual's life. The situation is not as clear with Tah Osiris, but we have this tantalizing possibility that we're looking at closely. Here are some of the wrapping features of Tah Osiris, and we're talking about a very systematic approach. These are professional wrapping experts. The amount of linen used in this mummy is quite high, and in the cost of Egyptian burials, linen was an important factor. People would store bundles and bundles of linen against the day of their death so that there would be enough cloth to make their mummy. We have that in Demotic language accounts from the period. And again, Tah Osiris was very voluminously wrapped in the lower extremities. And we can see that a lot of different kinds of things are being done to protect her legs. And of course, mobility was extremely important in the netherworld. So many spells deal with being able to walk in the netherworld. So we have a notion that the amount of time and effort and linen expended on the legs has a reason for existing. And we see here that the linen, which is the dark gray, is in some areas saturated with probably some of this botanical sap or resin, which is helping to stabilize the mummy and is really responsible for why so many of these mummies exist today. In addition, Tah Osiris's mummy was equipped with what we call shin cords. Each shin was equipped with a piece of twisted linen into a cord on the front of each shin within the wrappings. It has no technical necessity. You can wrap a leg without one of these shin cords, so we think very clearly that these are symbolic elements. A Polish Egyptologist, Andrzej Nowinski, noted about 30 years ago that in a mummy that he was unwrapping at that point, when he found these, that these shin cords were meant to represent the stems of a lotus flower and probably represented to the Egyptians a form of magical resurrection, because the lotus is a symbol of resurrection. You know, it is closed and then magically opens at dawn. What makes Tah Osiris that much more fascinating is that she has a cord which stretches the entire length of her body of similar type, a bit larger, a longitudinal cord, which we have not seen in any other mummy to date. So Tah Osiris is an extremely interesting mummy. The pathologies affecting her life included osteopenia, mineral weakness of the bone, possibly as a result of nutritional deficits in her lifetime. There is possible plaque formation in some of the arteries, the medial artery of her leg, her left leg, which is interesting. It's a possibility, but generally she is not osteoarthritic. She is a relatively young person, and there is no sign of what may have ended her life. It must have been some form of infectious disease. There is no visible trauma other than a minor separation of the symphysis of the pubic bone, but not enough for that to be indicative that she may have had a child. We just don't know at this point. Moving on to Padibastet, we know as a result of the study that he was a male aged over 50 and possibly closer to 60. His living stature was between 5'6" and 5'7", which is slightly above average for an Egyptian male of the Ptolemaic period. His preparation is similar to Tah Osiris. The excerebration route, the route for brain removal, is transnasal through the nose. He has a different style of insert into the nostrils. It's simple cloth. And then his mouth is filled with cloth. The level of resin used in his brain case is about 3 times as much as was used with Tah Osiris, which is interesting in terms of his preparation pattern. And there's a lot of pasting of the layers of his mummy bundle. They're using a lot of resin paste in putting together his wrapping. So here we see in this image the cloth that is placed in his mouth. There seems to be some damage to the incisors of his mouth. We don't know why that would be. His head is still wrapped, so that damage occurred prior to burial. And we also see in this image a fair amount of attention is paid to his ears, which have been, I think it's quite poetic, allowed to stand out straight, as if this was one of his distinctive features. They could have pressed those ears back, but they didn't. They've been liberally coated with resin and allowed to basically stick out. We can also see that his dental health was, while not atrocious, and often Egyptian mummies have atrocious dental health. He does have some abscesses in the jaw and some tooth loss. The distribution of the visceral packets in this mummy is really rather different from what we saw with Tah Osiris. The packets are much larger. We believe that his mummy is about 30 to 50 years later in time. So this is a mummy not from 275 BC, but probably closer to 225 BC. toward the end of the 3rd century BC. Again, his lower extremities show quite a bit of pasting, and this is a feature which is very distinctive in him. The embalmers were clearly concerned with providing additional protection below the waist for Padibastet. And I should note at this point, because I forgot to do so earlier, that Tah Osiris, that is that woman's name. It's bona fide based on the inscriptions that occur on her coffin. But Padibastet is a name which was applied to that mummy by a dealer. And it's actually the name of a 23rd dynasty king who lived 500 years before Padibastet's time in order to attract a buyer. So Padibastet is a name that we use lovingly, but it is not this person's actual name. So anyway, there's quite a bit of protection being afforded within the wrapping. And again, the legs are wrapped voluminously. There's a lot being done below the waist for this mummy. And why is that, we wonder? I mentioned earlier that Akhmim was the center of the worship of a fertility god by the name of Min. And we know for a fact that many of the priests of that cult were involved in fertility rituals. In other words, the worship of Min related to the fertility of Egypt in general. And each year there was a major celebration in which dances were performed, and by the men, female musicians would play the music and accompaniment, and there would be rites related to the fecundity of male Egyptians, the ability of the earth to bring forth crops, to regenerate each year. And this is what this population was doing religiously in its rituals in Akhmim. So we see in Padibastet what may possibly be a vestige of that in the way the body has been treated. Between the legs, we have quite a bit of protection being provided for his genitals, which the Victorian in me has difficulty stating, but it has to be at least pointed out. The pathologies in Padibastet are far greater than those in Tah Osiris. Osteopenia, again, the skeletal weakness, the demineralization of bone. You can see in the spine, the amount of air space in the trabecular bone is pretty severe. His neck shows vertebral wedging, which might have been painful for him, probably was, and lipping at the meeting points between vertebrae, which you see here, of not very healthy, spinally speaking. He had degenerative joint disease, osteoarthritis, and quite noticeable subchondral lesions or cysts. And there's also a fracture of the right forearm, which is probably ancient. So here are these subchondral cysts, and it's a fancy word, subchondral, but it means simply bone adjacent to cartilage or bone below cartilage. So this is one of these cysts, which would have been filled with fluid. They're often called hyatid cysts. And his legs and even his feet are filled with these voids, which are not life-endangering, but certainly indicate an undermining of the strength of the bone itself. One of the more important findings, both his legs and his pelvic bone show these subchondral lesions or cysts. And again, back to the phallic sheathing, it's impossible to exclude mentioning the prodigious size of Padibastet genitally, and the amount of preparation that went on inside the bandaging to provide protection or some other magical factor in relation to this individual is really noteworthy. And it's all supposition, of course, but we have to state that in relation to the religion of this particular city and the possibility that he himself was a priest of Akhmim, which we can't say for sure, his coffin is pretty badly chewed up, we must at least provide some mention of these characteristics. Thank you very much for your attention.
Jonathan, thank you for walking us through your examination of these two mummies. It's really wonderful a year later to see how much you have pieced together with your team and how much information we are beginning to learn not only about these two mummies, but in relation to others. And I think what strikes me so much in listening to you as you contextualize this research is really how important it is not only to look at the individual mummies that we have before us, but them in relation to others in your study. And it underscores how lucky we are to have you and your team who have been looking at mummies from this location and from this period in comparison so thoroughly. So thank you for sharing this work. There have been several questions posed in the Q&A, and I want to make sure that you have the opportunity to address them for our audience, and I'm sure that others will arise. Going back to the very beginning of your talk, you showed to us that there were visceral packets and explained those to us because we began to see them in little VP throughout your maps. And the question was asked if the packets were returned to the body, as we saw in these two Ptolemaic mummies, what was done with the canopic jars? Were they still used? Was something inside of them? Could you help us to understand that relationship?
Sure. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Canopic jars were developed in the Old Kingdom, and the jars themselves began to acquire a symbolism unto themselves. The use of the jars begins to wane essentially after 500 BC. And we begin to see even before 500 BC, the use of jars that are solid, that are meant to represent themselves. So the jar represents the deity. So originally, in other words, the jars were able to contain the internal organs, and those organs are essentially coterminous with the deities that are represented in the jar. And I know that sounds confusing, but let me just say this. The text of a canopic jar, which in many periods was inscribed on the front of the jar, would say, you know, I am Imseti. Imseti is a word for liver. So I am liver. So there is no separation, as we would say, between the deity and the organ itself. So when the practice wanes, you have the use of what are called, I don't like the term, but they're often called dummy jars. But these are solid jars. You cannot open them. They have a lid with the form of the deity in question. It's a little sculpture of a jar. And those were often provided with mummies whose own organs were placed inside them in these cylindrical visceral packets. By the Ptolemaic period, by and large, the jars, though still used to some extent, were hardly ever hollow and capable of actually receiving an internal organ. The organs were in most cases placed within the packets. I hope that clarified it.
I think so. There are other questions in the Q&A, and as we begin to work through them, I want to also welcome Melinda Hartwig, who has joined the visible panelists for the conclusion and the Q&A and might add to some of the discussion. Melinda is our curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Carlos Museum, and it is Melinda's guidance that brought these two mummies into our collection, and it is her tremendous research into these objects, including the mummies, that will result in their exhibition in 2023. So something we're all working toward. There was another question in the Q&A related to organs that are removed, and it specifically is to ask about the status of the heart in organ removal by embalmers in this period. I know in each of the jars, a specific organ is given to each of the little gods that are associated by their heads to the jars. And so what about the heart?
Yes, of course. And I depended a little bit too much, I think, on my maps to sort of explain, both these mummies still have cardiac tissue. They still have their hearts intact. And the heart, contrary to what we may have seen in Hollywood productions, is an organ which the Egyptians tried, with all of their might to avoid removing, though it sometimes has happened. We do have mummies where the hearts are no longer extant, but by and large, the heart was left in the body. And by the way, the heart was the seat of the intellect and the seat of the conscience to the ancient Egyptians. It's often said that the brain was undervalued by them, and that's why we don't have a jar with brain in it. What did the Egyptians understand by the brain? Well, basically, the Egyptians, what we understand of a brain, they thought was going on in the heart. And that's why they were so quick to remove the brain and were so loath to remove the heart. It's the seat of intellect, of conscience. And as the Egyptians would say in their own funerary spells, heart of my mother, do not testify against me in the netherworld. To an Egyptian, I really have a strong notion that your heart is coextensive with the heart of your own mother. We know how we feel about our mom. You don't do anything against what she wants, and I think the Egyptians viewed the heart similarly. So the heart is an organ which is essential to remaining in the body.
Clearly, there were so many very specific practices that, as I appreciated you noted in the beginning, evolved and changed. And so one of the things that's so vibrant about studying these mummies is understanding how this very religious practice evolved and changed, which must be reflective of change in understanding and belief system in the ancient Egyptian world. We do have a question in the chat that really points to whether you find in the mummies any indication intentionally incorporated into those wrappings of the living occupation of the deceased.
Generally, in studying mummies, we look at what their bodies have sustained in terms of damage in trying to establish occupational differences. So for example, wear and tear on the limbs, or obvious crushing weight borne by an individual in their lifetime, shown in a certain amount of structural collapse of the spine and so forth. Those are clear indications of occupation. It gets more difficult when we're talking about people who are not engaged in strong physical behavior, or at least none that we recognize as such. So, but it's interesting in looking at, say, the mummies of women. What we've noticed in several cases are women, ancient women, mummified, of considerable age. But if you take a look at their lower extremities, their legs are very strong. They look really good. And it really raises some interesting questions when it comes to the daily behavior as well as the occupation of these individuals. Many of the women from Akhmim, for example, are in effect priestesses, but what does that mean? It means that they were involved in performance. These are people that had to really do things. They were dancers. They had to go on fairly long parades, on either side of a cortege with a sacred image on top. I don't know if anyone saw the business in Cairo with the parade of the royal mummies that went on a couple of weeks ago, but they had everybody dressed up. It looked like half the population of Cairo was accompanying the mummies. And, that kind of thing went on quite frequently in ancient Egypt. These parades, these religious festivals and so forth required quite a bit of performance. And I think we see that type of occupation in the strength of, I'll just say, the strength of the female leg. It's undeniable in so many of these mummies.
Thank you. In fact, one of the related questions in the chat pointed to just that. Could we perhaps think about whether there was dance or professional dance as part of evidence in the wrappings and preservation and the physical remains themselves in these bodies? I think that there's also a lot of curiosity, as you shared, about this metal preparation at the ankles and how unusual that is. It's fascinating that we have something interesting to offer out of this mummy and that it might be the first you've seen. Do you have any sort of theories to share with us about what that's doing there beyond what you already mentioned?
I have my speculations, and I have to add at this point that I was assisted in this analysis by two very able forensic scientists, Dr. Robert Loynes of the University of Manchester and Dr. James Shenandoah of the University of Jamestown in North Dakota, Fargo, North Dakota. And we talked about some of these issues, in particular, Dr. Loynes commenting on that metallic ankle preparation. He pointed out that, this is metallic, but it isn't gold, for example. Okay, and I thought that was interesting. Obviously, the Egyptians had access to all kinds of other metals. We're just not able radiographically to identify which metal was used. But let's just suppose that it was copper. We all know that copper has a warming effect on the body. And in fact, you'll see people who have arthritis wearing copper bracelets, for example. So one of these suppositions on my part is that it could be a copper preparation that may have related to the provision of warmth to the body. Now that's a bit of a stretch. I just want to say that I come up with all kinds of speculations, but then I say, that's a stretch. But I have to state it, otherwise we don't get anywhere, because you have to start with basically, some kind of observation of what's possible, and then through process of elimination, bring yourself back into sanity or something. But we know that the feet in an individual are nerve centers and are extremely important, the importance of foot massage. In ancient Egypt, and what has been found in certain mummies, are the provision on the feet, on the soles of the feet in particular, of root stock. So there's this notion that if you provide a root bulb under a person's foot, that some magical event will occur. And this is noted in some of the very old literature from mummy unwrappings, some of it going back to the 18th century, where we unwrapped this mummy today and we found on the sole of its foot the bulb of some kind of plant, this sort of thing, written on parchment. This kind of information is available. We know they did that. They are involved in all kinds of symbolic activity, and that may be part of what's going on. So in other words, the ankles are being encircled by something metallic, which is supposed to achieve something for this body to keep it incorruptible. I always return to the Egyptian command, the body must be incorruptible. And much of what goes on with mummies relates to, in terms of the funerary preparation, has to do with keeping them absolutely beyond all corruption. That's all we can say at this point.
In that effort to make the body beyond corruption and therefore to help the soul be reunited in the netherworld with the body, what about evidence of interference with that body during its living life in order to repair it? Surgeries in particular, and the question is specifically about maxilla surgeries or cleft palates. Have you seen evidence in your own looking so thoroughly at mummies of these types of interventions, and specifically those maxilla surgeries?
Yeah, there is evidence for that, and the evidence of that is various. So for example, in the 12th dynasty, say around just after 2000 BC, maybe 1800 BC, in this particular case, a governor in a portion of Egypt known as Middle Egypt, north of Akhmim, but not very far from Akhmim, named Jehudi Nacht, his skull was surgically altered at the time of mummification in order to, it's theorized, make it possible for a ceremony known as opening the mouth. That's the name of the ritual, to make that possible. So portions of his mandible were removed surgically. So we know the Egyptians were doing things of that kind to the dead. There are several examples of dental work, prostheses, extractions, that kind of thing. Bridges, dental bridges even have been found made of copper, and you wonder to what extent these people died from blood poisoning or something from the metals that were used. But it does occur. And it's interesting when it comes to dentistry in ancient Egypt, we know that in the Old Kingdom that there were several important officials who are, I suppose if you translated their titles, they would be seen as dental practitioners, physician of the mouth of the king, that sort of thing. And they were high status individuals. So there is a certain amount of evidence for both post-mortem manipulation, dental manipulation. There is evidence of perimortal surgery. It may not have been successful. Then there are cases where clearly the person survived whatever intervention was performed. We have a case in our study group, an Akhmeemic mummy, a really interesting one for this reason. It underwent trepanation, which was essentially surgery on the top of the head in this particular case, where they actually carved a pretty sizable hole in the summit of the skull, of the cranium. And there are signs that that person survived. There's minute healing enough to say that, well, it may not have been a successful operation, but they were trying to relieve pressure from the skull or what have you. And this person survived for 3 weeks after that operation. So it's pretty astounding what we learn with each new mummy that we examined.
I'm always amazed at how much we are able to interpret from the images. And it strikes me that that is the same as when Bill Torres and his team, look at human bodies today. You're trying to interpret what you can figure out about their health and their disease and from the images themselves. And Bill, you've looked at so many mummies with us, and now most recently in this project a year ago. And I'm just wondering how much you both perhaps are struck by where there is similarity, in these kinds of surgeries or in the status, the health, because I imagine that you're taking your knowledge of 20th and 21st century bodies back with you, Bill, when you look at these ancient ones, and that the same is somewhat true for you, Jonathan, in that you're kind of moving the knowledge back and forth through the centuries as you understand and interpret these bodies.
For me, I see the body and I can tell where we are and what we're looking at, but my knowledge of the inside and what was put in is very minimal. But I have learned a lot by listening to and working with some of these people. So it's when Dr. Elias was talking about the bony abnormalities there, I could see everything easily, but other than that, I can't do anything.
One of the things that I hear from physicians right away is that I in some cases, a mummy is the inverse of what they're normally seeing with patients. And, I am not a medical doctor, I'm a PhD, so when I look at CT scans, they're always of mummies. These are people who have been basically, in most cases, emptied out. So when I saw CT scans of myself and other people who have not been emptied out, I don't know what I'm looking at. My gosh, is there all that stuff in there? Is the first thing that comes to my mind. So one of the interesting things about Egyptian mummies is that there are different patterns when it comes to evisceration. Some mummies are not eviscerated. I've worked on several projects where the mummies have not really undergone any discernible evisceration. The internal organs were left in. In some cases, we can tell because there's not much left of the body because the organs were left in. And as we know from the history of mummification that we've learned as children and so forth, if those organs are not removed, we are digested by the very digestive juices that we depend on to digest our own food, which was the great revolution, I think, when it came to what the Egyptians did with embalming. Nevertheless, in the literature, there are references, and not so long ago, to kidneys that have been seen on CT inside of Egyptian mummies. And the great early mummy scientist, Grafton Elliott Smith, took special note of the mummies and he unwrapped a lot of mummies. I wish that he had left more notes behind, but he was always saying how this mummy still had its kidneys and, the heart and the kidneys were never removed and this sort of thing. But when we look at mummies, it's only very rarely that we are lucky enough to find kidneys. But many mummies have not really undergone appreciable evisceration, and they have their brains in many cases. There's a mummy in Louisiana that has identifiable brain tissue. Both hemispheres of the brain are perfectly visible. It's shrunken, but that's brain. It's really pretty fascinating. And then there's a mummy in San Francisco that I worked on 3 years ago, where the brain is extremely well preserved, though anything below the level of the head has essentially turned to clay. And then we've seen mummies where this turning of flesh into clay really happens. You know, it sounds like I'm quoting from Edgar Allan Poe, but when you study lots of different mummies, you see all kinds of natural process going on within these bodies. That's why Ptolemaic mummies that are so well preserved in the way that the Emory mummies are from the Senusret collection, it makes it so much, you really appreciate what they were able to do.
It's amazing to me how many mummies you've seen and yet how many questions there are. It seems that you have a task ahead of you forever to come, and that in fact, that could be in part because there are so many mummies. So to that end, how many, I mean, when was mummification abandoned as a practice in Egypt so that we can have some sense that you will have an endpoint in your quest, a date from which you no longer have to look beyond?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll state the beginnings of mummification have been pushed back and back and back. So, 30 years ago, people would have said, well, sort of first dynasty, 2800 BC, that sort of thing, the sort of contemporary with the building of the pyramids, say 2600 BC, that sort of thing, because we have canopic jars that early. We don't have the mummy that went with the jars, but we have her jars, that sort of thing. But those boundaries have been pushed back into a more remote past. So at Hierakonpolis, Renee Friedman and her team have been finding bodies that are at least partially, not just naturally mummified in hot earth, warm ground, in a shallow grave, like many pre-dynastic bodies, but they're showing the use of the botanical resins, the sort of frankincense and myrrh being added in. They're using these botanical saps in order to help preserve parts of the body at least. And that's before 3000 BC. The end date for mummification, certainly when Christianity became the religion of Egypt, at the end of the 4th century. Well, it occurred at the beginning of the 4th century, but by the end of the 4th century, it's very hard to find a body which has undergone artificial mummification. You'll still have mummies, but they are natural mummies, hot earth, proper drying environment, etc., right? Soil, chemistry, all that business. But it was part of the ancient religion. It had to go as soon as you had Christianity in Egypt. But it was a slow process. It took more than a century from, say, 325, AD 325, up to the end of the 4th century. But the Egyptian religion, the old practices, were actively discouraged and persecuted. And it destroyed a couple of things. It destroyed mummification, and it destroyed the Egyptian language, which was seen as a sacred tongue, and therefore that had to go.
Well, it seems that you have no end of work ahead of you, because not only does it start so early, but it stretches so long, and there's yet so many questions to be answered. One of the things that's so interesting about your chosen focus on Akhmim is the long occupation and incredible amount of preservation still to be excavated at that site. And as a final question, it's been raised in our notes here that it appears from the map of Akhmim that much of the necropolis was on the east side of the river. And we wonder if you might share some thoughts about that, and that if that might be a place to close.
Okay, sure. Yeah, the sunset of the talk, so to speak. Yeah. So, we learned that the Egyptians believed that the West was the the sacred land. And so we're heading west and eventually we'll disappear beyond the western horizon. So when you have a city like Akhmim, and I'm willing to say that half the cities in Egypt are on the east side of the river, not on the west, and therefore, unlike Thebes, which happens to be, at least the cemeteries, mostly located on the western side of the Nile, Akhmim and many other centers in Egypt are located on the east. The Egyptians had the ability to work that out. And what they were concerned with was the position, relatively speaking, of each body in relation to the sunrise. Would the light of the morning sun reach the deceased? So actually, from that point of view, an east bank location for a cemetery actually makes a lot of sense. And so they had no problem with having vast cemeteries on the eastern side of the river. It's actually an excellent question as to why you do not have a major cemetery. There are some cemeteries in the Akhmim neighborhood that are located on the western side of the river, but not to the extent that you have on the east. That is, just an excellent question. But the Egyptians, generally speaking, I would say, had it figured out in terms of relative location of the body in relation to the morning light. That was extremely important to them, at least early on. In the Middle Kingdom, very important to have the coffin facing toward the east. And I could see that a cemetery located on the east side of the Nile in that early period would retain its hallowed status as a efficacious burial place over time. So tradition trumped all other considerations. The other aspect of it has to do with the quality of the stone available, the geology of the various locations. And I haven't studied the western side of the Akhmim province to be able to comment intelligently at this point. But the Egyptians were also very concerned with the quality of the rock in which tombs were being cut. And it is possible that there was less. The valley is very wide there. So those western locations may have been too distant in that particular area, and the stone might not have been quite as good as the stone on the east side of the river.
Jonathan, I'm going to capitalize on your comment about tradition being the powerful tool here that we cling to and that they held on to dearly. And thank you for helping us to continue the Carlos's tradition of offering excellent insight through lectures and conversation. We've really each done a careful and close looking with you at these two mummies, and we will continue that tradition together as we can go forward with Melinda and Bill's help to understand these mummies and prepare them for their exhibition at the Carlos Museum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It would be a pleasure to have you in person again, and we look forward to that, but we're delighted that this Zoom webinar format allowed us to bring you and all this great information to so many people who've joined us tonight. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you.